Okay, so and the whole thing about autistic traits, that cracks me up. It's like, yes, of course, everybody's got autistic traits. It doesn't make you autistic. That's the whole point. In fact, this is one of the major flaws for clinicians, in that we know there is no unique autistic behaviour, or we know there's no unique pattern of behaviours, and yet all sets of diagnostic criteria are patterns of behaviour. They're tick list approaches too. Does the person do this, 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 and this? You can't have both. It's oxymoronic on the one hand to say there is no one pattern of behaviour that is diagnosable for autism, and on the other hand, all sets of diagnostic criteria that clinicians are actually going to use are going to be based on that assumption. It's completely inaccurate, it's totally flawed. While we're on that subject, where do you find autism in terms of the diagnostic criteria? International Classification of Diseases, it's not a disease, and in a publication by the American Psychiatric Association, it's not a psychiatric illness. Even at that very, very, very basic level, for years, society's got it wrong, completely wrong. And I think there's the year in, year out of thinking that is based on this kind of house of cards that is not substantiated is hugely problematic for the population, hugely problematic. The whole thing about traits, I've got pets at home. If I was to go home this afternoon and Sandy was to come up, or Sandy Pancake Waggy Eyes to give her full title, and she's bouncing around, say, oh, hello Sandy, oh crikey, you've got, you're a furry quadruped with a tail. I think you've got cat traits, I've just noticed. Or if Bella comes up and says, oh, you're a furry quadruped, with a tail, you've got dog traits. I know you're meowing, but, you've dog traits. So I'm going to treat you more like a dog. It's a ludicrous kind of concept. And it's very, very unfair, obviously, for people with autism. I'm not saying that there is nobody with autism who might be considered to be impaired in communication or whatever, but this is a different way of thinking, and it's a very valid way of thinking. I would say that because it's my way of thinking, but I genuinely believe there's a high level of validity behind this thinking. The concept of the triad of impairments is basically based on statistics of populations. Basically what it's based on. The majority of people do things in this way, people with autism do it in a different way, and immediately that was termed impaired. That's basically what happens. And I just think conceptually, that's extraordinarily unfair. And reality, actually, if you scrutinise the reality, it's actually inaccurate anyway. For example, I'll move on to a better example in a bit. Myth number 4, people with autism are unsociable. Neurotypical people, you will find individuals who are neurotypical who don't want any friends. Then you find other neurotypical people who want loads and loads of friends. There's a spectrum, if you like, of sociability. It's exactly the same in the population of people with autism. Exactly the same. I don't see any difference whatsoever. It's an intuitive understanding of the neurotypical social skills. That's a different matter altogether. But this concept of it's based on sociability is completely moronic. Those clinicians who say, well, you can't be autistic because you've got too many friends, or some nonsense like that. By the way, there is nothing that a person with autism can't do just because they're autistic. Nothing. I have people who contact me and say, often legally, and say, well, is it possible that, or can this person be a parent because they're autistic, or can this person do whatever? It's like, or I had somebody contact me recently and said, I'm a television presenter, does that mean I can't be autistic? There isn't anything that a person with autism can't do, by definition of being autistic. There are plenty of things that a person with autism is going to find extraordinarily difficult compared to their neurotypical peers. It doesn't mean to say, and there are certain things that individuals will find impossible, but just being autistic doesn't preclude you from anything at all. Absolutely nothing. And again, it's one of those things that people get all shy away. They think, well, if I'm autistic, I can't do this. Or if my child's autistic, they won't be able to do it. As Mark said, the potential is infinite, essentially, for a person with autism. Having additional problems, comorbidity and learning disabilities and so on, that throws a spanner in the works to a certain degree as well. But being autistic itself doesn't preclude you from doing anything at all. By the way, the flip side of that is just because a person with autism can do something doesn't mean that they should be forced to do it. The whole thing in mainstream school, well, we know he can do assembly. Why is it so important to do assembly? But, we know he can do assembly because he did it last week. It's like, yes, he collapsed for 3 days afterwards, but he did do assembly. And because he did assembly last week, he can do it again now. And I always say, well, that person in a wheelchair could get up the stairs if they really wanted to. They could drag themselves up. But if there was a fire, they'd soon get out of their wheelchair and drag themselves up. Just because they can doesn't mean they should. And again, it might appear perhaps a bit of an over-the-top analogy. It's not over-the-top analogy at all. The neurological distress caused to people with autism for forcing them in situations that they find extraordinarily difficult, though not necessarily visible to the neurotypical population, is enormous, absolutely enormous. The exhaustion of having to be somebody that you're not, or to figure things out the whole time, is absolutely shattering for some individuals, neurologically, intellectually, emotionally. Absolutely shattering. And often we don't see that. We don't see the repercussions of those, because people with autism have learned they've been told, you know, you can't be this, you can't be this, you can't be this. So they've learned to hide who they actually are. The whole thing about sociability, I have to say, is pretty beyond me anyway. This whole thing about social chit-chat, you know, talking utter garbage just to fill time is actually extraordinarily illogical. But again, it's these kind of concepts: you've got to be social, you've got to do things. Another thing that really drives me bonkers is this whole thing about teamwork. Well, it's really good to work as a team. And I think, well, what if you don't work well as a team? Then logically, it doesn't work very well. I am very, very effective working on my own. My capacity for work is almost infinitely higher than if you put me with somebody else. There's no point. I don't want to work well as a team, because I won't. And she found it so difficult to understand. You just think, well, what's the problem with that? You know, logically, there's nothing to say. Well, actually, having two people working in isolation, an output of 100% is better than sticking them together working at 75%. It's crystal clear. Just because most neurotypical people like being in a team does not necessarily make it productive. That's right, and I can appreciate that it serves a purpose for them, but it doesn't serve a purpose for me. So actually, trying to force those two entities together, actually, logically, is not a productive way of working.